Well, Canadians are starting to get the worst of both worlds because there's news that on the surface looks really good, but once you actually start peeling back the layers, you can see that even this good news is actually just part of a bigger problem. And what is this good news? Well, it's that the new numbers are in and the Canadian economy has grown way faster than anyone expected in the first quarter of 2023. Real GDP grew at an annualized rate of 3.1%. That GDP, of course, being gross domestic product, which is just the number that you get when you add up all of the goods and services that Canadians have bought and sold, and it's generally used as an indicator of how an economy is doing. Now, on the surface, this looks like good news, right? The Canadian economy is stronger than expected, things are looking up, but let me tell you the two reasons that this news is actually bad for the average Canadian, because once you understand this, everything is going to make a whole hell of a lot more sense. The first problem is that we're actually not measuring the right numbers at all. You might be wondering, why does my quality of life seem like it's worse in Canada if the economic numbers are actually looking good and we're supposed to be growing and GDP is supposed to be a measure of economic health? Well, yes, GDP does measure growth in a country, but it doesn't measure how this growth actually impacts and compares to the actual Canadians' quality of life. Because when you actually take Canadian citizens and Canadian people into consideration in context of this number, well, you get a far different information. And I'll use this as a quick example. It's way simplified and using simple numbers so that I can do the math quickly here, but I think this is going to make so much more sense. Let's say in 1 year, Canada has a GDP of $1 million and there are only 1,000 Canadians in Canada. Now, if you divide that GDP up amongst the people who actually live in Canada, you'll get a $1,000 GDP per person. Now, if we look at year two, oh, this looks good. The GDP is up. Last year it was $1 million. Now it's $1,040,000. So politicians might say, hey, look how well the economy is doing right now. But meanwhile, the population has grown in Canada. There's 1,100 Canadians. So now this increased GDP number only actually represents a decrease in the GDP per person, right? When you divide that GDP up by the amount of Canadians that are sort of being tracked by it. I think you get where I'm going with this, right? This GDP per person or GDP per capita, which most people say, is often used as a measure of the average citizen's productivity and as a result, the average Canadian's quality of life. The more your economy grows on a per person basis, the better that country's living standards get on average. I will admit, though, that sometimes this GDP per capita number isn't exactly perfect. One of these problems is that this number doesn't really account for how wealth is sort of distributed across a country, but nonetheless, I still think that it's a helpful way for us to look at a country's performance. Now, when we look at the Canadian economy's growth from this perspective with the GDP per capita or GDP per person, well, we get a different story, right? This article says Canada's worst decade for real economic growth since the 1930s, the decade with the Great Depression. Now, this is using GDP per capita numbers, and we can continue on down here. They say, let me zoom in so you can actually get a better view of this. Over the last 10 years, real GDP per capita grew just 0.8% per year on average in this country. It's the lowest rate of growth since the 1930s. Total GDP has been growing because of our growing population, but GDP per person has been essentially stagnant. And while this growth rate is not so great today, it's also not going to be so great tomorrow because the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, essentially 29 different countries that have gotten together saying, hey, let's all work collaboratively to improve our economies. Well, based on their forecasts, between 2020 and 2060, Canada will be the lowest amongst all 29 of those countries in terms of this growth of their GDP per person. Now, you might be thinking right about now, Russell, does this mean that you think that all population growth, especially immigration in this country, is bad since it brings down our GDP per capita number? Well, to that, I'd say no, that's not what I think. I think immigration's important. Canada, especially right now, is trying to grow its workforce amidst all of the retiring baby boomers, right? That's an important thing that we sort of need support on with via immigration, right? And additionally, on top of that, increasing the population via immigration also increases the taxes that can be collected from those people, which in theory will be appropriately used by the government to improve our social services. On top of all that, in my eyes, immigration also improves Canada by bringing more contrasting viewpoints and ideas. However, and that's a big however, I'm an example that someone can be pro-immigration while also being very concerned about the extremely high rate of it and how quickly it is happening currently. Last year, Canada broke a record in terms of how many new Canadians were added to the country, with 437 new permanent residents added in 2022, breaking the previous record of 405,000 back in 2021, the year prior. And right now, Canada is on pace to admit just under that amount for the year of 2023 if we sort of expand Q1 of 2023 out for the full entire year. And this year, we're on pace to admit just a little bit less than that by the end of the year if you take the first 3 months of the year and sort of expand that rate out over the rest of 2023. So by all measures, we're rapidly increasing the amount of people that we're bringing into the country. And this is right in line with the government's plans. They said that they wanted to add, on average, 500,000 new Canadians per year over the next 3 years, totaling 1.5 million new Canadians over the next 3 years. Now, on the surface level, this makes the government look good, right? Because with more people, you have more people working, more people buying things, and as a result, our GDP number grows, right? Our GDP number, which most politicians use as an indicator of our economic health, will grow. But what won't grow, or won't grow at as high of a rate, is the GDP per capita number that we've been talking about for the past 5 minutes. But not only does this high pace decrease the GDP per capita numbers we've been talking about, but also this high pace of immigration could tarnish Canada's reputation as a desirable place to actually immigrate to. As housing costs and the general costs of living increase and pressure is put on the healthcare system, well, perhaps less people will want to live here, reducing the long-term benefits that we could have had from slow and steady immigration over time. So that was the first reason that these high and strong GDP numbers aren't exactly what they seem, the fact that GDP is different from GDP per capita. Now, the second reason that we have to talk about has to do specifically with the Bank of Canada and how this new information might force them to actually increase interest rates. Now, let me talk you through exactly why the strong Canadian economy is currently the Bank of Canada's biggest fear. It seems like it's kind of backwards, right? You see, the Bank of Canada's biggest fear is inflation right now. Now, historically, the Bank of Canada's targeted having inflation be between 1% and 3%, and they did for a long time successfully, but that changed as a result of the pandemic, high amounts of money printing, so on and so forth. If you watch the channel, you've heard me spiel about all of that, and they got especially worried when inflation was 400% higher than where they actually wanted it to be at 8%. They got so spooked that this high number caused them to raise interest rates at the fastest pace that we've seen in recent memory in Canada, making it far less likely that Canadians will go out and spend money. When we have higher interest rates, it's more expensive to borrow, people feel less certain about things, they feel less wealthy because their houses might have gone down in value as these low interest rates can no longer prop up their housing values. Now, as a result of that, the Bank of Canada thinks, okay, if we crank up these interest rates, people won't spend as much money. They won't be able to spend as much money because they feel a little bit more poor, and as a result, that'll bring down demand, and you guys know supply and demand, that would result in lower inflation, right? You don't need to increase the cost of goods if there's less demand. But something happened over the past couple of weeks that hasn't happened since the Bank of Canada made these drastic changes, and that is that CPI inflation went up for the first time since they really started taking inflation seriously. Now, this has the Bank of Canada concerned, especially given the information we just got today that, well, the Canadian economy looks strong, GDP numbers are high. You see, a strong economy right now in the Bank of Canada's eyes means that Canadians might feel a little bit more comfortable, they might feel good enough to go out and spend some more money in the economy, and they might not need to feel like they need to cut back as much. Now, if this is true, again, in the eyes of the Bank of Canada, inflation could go up. And this is the number one fear of the Bank of Canada, right? If people feel good, go out and spend money, well, we might have more to do in our fight against inflation. So it's just gotten a lot more likely that the Bank of Canada is going to increase its interest rates at some point in the future, potentially next week at their next interest rate decision that they're going to announce here coming up. Because if they think, hey, inflation might not be done, we might want to get ahead of this, they might increase interest rates even more. Now that's going to make things a lot more expensive for a lot of Canadians. This means increased interest payments on all sorts of things, right? Including cars, mortgages, and it also often decreases the value of people's investments. So that's the second reason these GDP numbers aren't exactly what they seem, because the economy looks so strong while Canadian citizens might have to take this preventative punishment from the Bank of Canada for even longer, and they might have to go even further with it, right? But let's tie the first reason that we talked about in with this second reason. Couldn't an increased amount of the population due to a high pace of inflation actually make inflation a little bit worse? I mean, if there's more people to go out and buy things, that would increase demand, and maybe that would mean prices would go up. Well, here's what the governor of the Bank of Canada, Tiff Macklem, had to say when he was asked this recently during an interview. Take a look.
There are some underlying supports for demand. We've got strong immigration into this country. I mean, those new Canadians, new entrants to the economy, they're adding labor supply, which is really helpful for easing some of the pressures in the labor market. But of course, they're also adding demand. They need housing. They're getting jobs. They're getting incomes. They're spending them. They're adding demand. So, from a monetary policy point of view, inflation's not going to go away by itself. We still have some work to do there.
So he suggests that immigration in and of itself isn't going to be inflationary, because the Bank of Canada believes that the fact that there are labor shortages right now is inflationary in and of itself. And that's because if there's fewer workers, then businesses will have to pay workers more to come work for them instead of working some other place, right? This results in an increase of wage growth, which in the Bank of Canada's eyes, again, means that consumers have more to spend, and that in and of itself could be inflationary. So having many new Canadians to fill those jobs so that people don't need to increase the wages of those jobs is disinflationary in the Bank of Canada's eyes. And they say that this balances out the added amount of demand to buy goods and services that comes alongside population growth. Now, all in all, this is a pretty frustrating economic situation that we find ourselves in here in Canada. The government says that they're focused on growth, of course, and good jobs, but they ignore the types of policy that could actually lead to a growing economy on a per person basis. Things like making it easier for people to start new businesses, incentivizing entrepreneurship through tax benefits, and even by being early to the party when it comes to embracing new technologies and new emerging industries. But unlike you, most people don't spend like these 15 minutes out of their day going in depth when it comes to topics like this. So for the government, they can just keep it surface level and say, hey, look at the GDP, that's a good thing, and it's the result of us making good decisions about the economy, even if when you look a little bit deeper, maybe that's not exactly the case. Well, that's what I've been thinking about lately, and I'm curious what you think about it too. Let me know down in the comments what you think of all of this. I know there's going to be a lot of different opinions when it comes to this type of topic, so let me know. And subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so and you appreciate this Canadian-focused financial content. But with all of that said, thanks so much for watching, everybody. I really hope this video helped you out at least a little bit, and I'll see you next time.